Sorry about that.
Hi everyone. We'll give everyone a few minutes to join, and then we'll begin this conversation with Robert and Sophie from Weingut Prager.
Hello.
I need something while people are joining. I'll get something in my glass.
Good choice.
Way ahead of you.
Oh well, we'll do the same. You want that or that?
Ich habe jetzt den
Okay.
Riesling.
Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And if you're watching us on YouTube, thank you for tuning in. This is a real pleasure for me to have a little bit of time with one of the great estates that we represent in our portfolio at Prager Estate. My name is Jesse Becker. I'm a Master Sommelier, and I work with our team at Prager Estate here at Weingut. And one of the great wineries that we have the pleasure of representing for the United States and that I have the pleasure of working with is Weingut Prager from the Wachau, and truly one of the great estates in Austria today. So I want to say thank you to Robert Bodenstein and SophieHelen Hinterhölzl. So thank you so much for joining us. So because we have so many people that tune in later on YouTube, I did want to give a little bit of context and explain a little bit about the region of the Wachau before we really dive into the wines of Prager. And so just to start and to get our bearings, you know that Austria is a small country in Europe, in sort of Central Europe, and it's landlocked. So there's no big body of water here, and in fact, most of the country is the Alps. So you'll find that almost all of the wine growing occurs on the eastern part of the side of the country, because the western part is the Alps. It's very high, of course, in elevation, and too high, in fact, to ripen the wine grape. And so that's why all of these regions that you see on the screen here are all in the east, near the Hungarian and Slovakian and Slovenian borders. And in fact, today, the area in yellow, this is called Niederösterreich, or the Lower Austria, which is where we find the Danube River Valley. And in fact, that's really what we're focused on today. And the Danube River Valley is really where we find all the great Grüner, Veltliner, and Riesling from Austria. And there's these three regions, all west of Vienna, not maybe more than an hour, 20 minutes by car along the Danube River west. And you would find these three regions all sort of clustered together very close to one another, the Kamptal, the Krimstal, and then of course the Wachau. And these are your three sort of premier wine regions in Austria, especially for great Grüner, Veltliner, and Riesling. And of course, our producer today, Prager, is in the Wachau, which is probably I would say, the most prestigious and well-known wine regions in Austria. Certainly, it has that international acclaim for the great wines that come from there. So this map is kind of helpful to see, even though it's quite small. It just gives us a sense that I suppose Wachau is something like, Robert or Sophie, correct me, but 15 kilometers or something like that. It's very small. 30
kilometers.
Oh, 30 kilometers. So from Krems down to the Abbey of Melk, I suppose. And within this area, you have 155 individually named RIED, or single vineyards. Most of them are on the north side of the Danube, on these very steep terraces. We'll see some great pictures of those in just a little bit. But this is a very small, compact area, but with many famous vineyards and very many famous producers as well. So Prager, just to point out, they're right in the heart of the Wachau, in the village of Weißenkirchen, right here. And most of the vineyards that they work with are near the town of Weißenkirchen. So, and one other thing I wanted to point out while we have this slide up on the screen is that you know that the members of the Vinea Wachau, which is a growers association that began here in 1983, they have a way of classifying the wines, and it's through a system of ripeness. Steinfeder being a style for dry wines, but up to 11.5% alcohol. Federspiel, very important style, 11.5 to 12.5% alcohol. And then you have Smaragd, which is the most powerful style at 12.5% alcohol and higher. But, these are designations of ripeness for dry wines, and this system is used exclusively by members of the Vinea Wachau. And I should point out that Prager, Franz Prager, was one of the very, in fact, I think one of the founding members of the Vinea Wachau in 1983. So, and then Sophie and Robert, I want to take some time to talk about this because it's brand new. There is now a DAC, or a controlled appellation for the Wachau, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about why this took so long to be put into place. Also, what it's all about for the Wachau in particular.
So in general, why it took so long is one of the main factors that it took so long was that the Wachau is constituted of not that many big wineries. You have, for example, the Domaine Wachau, which is the biggest winery of the Wachau Valley. And then you have, for example, our winery with 18 hectares, and that's, let's say, up to 30 hectares. It's a really big size already. 20 to 30 hectares in the Wachau is quite a lot of space to have. So the problem was, because the general thought with DUC in general was to limit the number of varieties that you can plant in a region, basically, in order to get to a system where, for example, if you say I'm drinking a Burgundy, a red wine from Burgundy, it's synonymous with Pinot Noir. The same way if I have a white wine from Burgundy, it's a Chardonnay. And that was the thinking behind the general DAC idea in Austria, which started in 2006 with the Weinviertel DAC. And there it is truly the case that you can say, oh, I'm having a white wine from the Weinviertel, and it's only going to be Grüner Veltliner. But typically Austria, you could say there are many regions in Austria that have not only one variety, especially also in Burgenland. You have a few regions that have 4 red wine varieties, 5 white wine varieties. So you can't say I'm drinking, you know, DAC region X wine and everybody knows the variety, because then everybody has to say what's the variety, and that's basically the question you want to eliminate with this system. But between 2006 and 2020, a lot of time has passed, and the system kept on changing and had a few reiterations, and therefore it was very important in the Wachau Valley due to the fact that we have a huge size of small vintners and also something called Heuriger, which is basically it's an eatery. It's not a restaurant where you can go in. You get cold foods, charcuterie, cheeses, locally sourced and locally produced, and you can only get the local produced wine. So it has to be the wine of the owner of the establishment. So, for example, they can't sell our wine there because it's supposed to be only their own production. Historically, it was also only their own food production, but that has proven a little difficult now, especially with cheese and everything. Therefore, that's been widened so that you can use basically the region as your deliverer for be it meat or cheese or whatever, but still the wine has to be from your own estate. And due to that fact, there are a lot of small vineyard spaces that have had, for example, Traminer for over 30-40 years. And now for basically the committee to say, well, this variety has no historical relevance in this region, or it's not indigenous here, is as difficult to put it in diplomatic terms. Yeah. Therefore, there has been a lot of discussions in the Wachau, and now they've come to the conclusion that this system with basically this pyramid with the 3 steps with region, village, and single vineyard wines was then created. So if you want to make a single vineyard wine, it can only be Grüner, Veltliner, and Riesling, with the reasoning that those 2 varieties have the best potential to truly reflect the vineyard's character in the wine, because other varieties are too dominant in their own characteristics of the variety, that the varietal character dominates basically the single vineyard character that would somehow influence the wine in different ways. And therefore you have the different wines on a village region or on a village level that are allowed, and that is also dependent, if I'm not mistaken, dependent on the villages themselves. So for example, there are certain varieties that are more locally produced in Spitz, therefore they're allowed in Spitz, but not, for example, in Unterloin. But that might have been also now an old iteration of the same system, but I still think it's the case. But that alone tells you how many iterations it went through. And then on a regional level, you still have 17 varieties that you can produce in the Wachau, and you can still say Wachau on the label, because that was the main part. A lot of the small vintners were afraid that they might have to write, you know, wine from Lower Austria on the bottles, even though it's sourced from the Wachau Valley. And so due to all those problems and difficulties, this system was chosen as the best represent the Wachau, and also to help consumers a little bit more.
Yeah, and some of my colleagues are writing to me saying my audio is not very good, and I'm wondering.
Yeah, it goes up and down somehow.
I thought it was due to my computer at first, so that's why I didn't say anything.
I wonder if it's maybe my webcam is picking up my audio, so I'll try to be a little louder and more clear. But so the system looks a lot like Burgundy, really. So regional wines, then Village, and then RIED. We should explain that in Austria, and they don't use this term anywhere else in German-speaking Europe, but it's a term that means single vineyard, and it's now required for all single vineyard wines in Austria.
Yeah.
So something very unique to Austria.
Yeah, starting with vintage 2016, and that was for me one of the most important recent changes to the Austrian wine law in general, if I might expand on that fact a little bit more, because that is also very consumer friendly, because the committee basically said there's been too many wines on the market that had very suggestive names. For example, I'm now freely translating close to the peach garden. And therefore it implies that the wine is sourced from a certain plot of space that is somewhere, whereas in fact it's just a fantasy name, and the grapes could be from all over the place, basically. Yeah. And due to the fact that a lot of those names were appearing more often on labels, the government basically put a stop to that by saying, okay, if you want to really produce from a single vineyard side of wine, you can do that, of course, but you have to add RIED to that, because then it's for the consumer, it's clear as water that this wine is being sourced from a single vineyard, and they're not grapes from anywhere else.
Yeah, good. Thanks for that explanation. Let me ask you, has my audio improved at all?
For me, it has, yeah.
It feels like you're going a bit like back and forth from the computer, so it's sometimes a bit louder, and then it is less loud.
I think it's due to the compressor limiter. It picks up a certain volume and...
Well, how about now?
Now you're very loud.
I can hear you clearly.
Which is good.
I think it's my webcam is now picking up the audio, so hopefully this will improve things. Thank you so much for the explanation, and we should move on and start tasting some wine soon, but here's the Prager winery in Weissenkirchen on the Wachau Strasse number 48, beautiful old building. When I see that, it makes me want to have some delicious fish with you at the restaurant across the street. It's a nice place. And here's the family. So in the center, Franz Prager, who passed away in 2019, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, last October.
But we have your well, Franziskaner, right?
It's good, yeah.
And then Toni Bodenstein, Robert, your father, and Ilse Prager. And I wanted to take the opportunity to kind of talk about your dad a little bit, Robert, because Franz had already built a very important and famous winery, but when Toni married your mom, really things even went to higher levels. So he contributed a lot. I know he's from Vienna, an academic.
Close to Vienna.
Don't say it's from Vienna, he will be mad.
Close to. He knows Vienna like his back pocket, but he's from close to Vienna. It's actually from the Weingut region, Wolkersdorf. That's about half an hour from Vienna.
Also wine growing region.
Ah, good. And I know he had an academic background when he came to the Wachau, and I think he applied a lot of this to the work in the vineyards and also in the cellar, but really studied the history of the Wachau region, really studied the geology, so has a great understanding of all of the different terroirs of the Wachau, and has really just ever since, I suppose, what was that, mid-90s?
My parents took over in the mid-90s, yeah. And fun fact, they both actually met at universities. The University of Agriculture, that's where my parents met. Their studies. And my mom was the tutor.
So a big important sort of development for Prager when Toni arrived. And now we have our newest generation. So Robert and Sophie, you're sort of leading the way now, taking over, I'm assuming, more and more responsibility for the winery all the time.
True, yeah. So I finally finished my master thesis last year in November. I got my degree finally. Took a while. I had finished the thesis was finished by early last year, but due to work and everything, I had to push on the defensio of my master thesis. But I've still been working for now 4 years, almost full time in the winery. And Sophie's been here with me now since February, actually.
Exactly. And your thesis has been a very difficult and very hard topic because you wrote about the terroir of the Achleiten.
Yeah.
And to get all the information from everywhere, it's not that easy. So obviously it took time, but you wrote a very good paper. That's a good thing.
I hope you read it.
Oh yeah, I did.
Well done. And so yeah, your master's thesis was actually on the terroir of this vineyard that we're looking at. This is the Achleiten, an 18-hectare vineyard of great geologic complexity, and for me, sort of when I think of the Wachau, it's sort of the quintessential vineyard, steep terrace that faces the Danube, and with mica schist and gneiss. And so most of your vineyards and most of the wines that you produce come from the Achleiten and vineyards that surround it, if I have that right.
Yeah. The Achleiten is especially very important for our Grüner Veltliner Smaragd. So we have from different sea level heights, different wines. So for example, the Grüner Veltliner Achleiten Smaragd is from the lower terraces. So that's about 200 meters above sea level. And then the highest one is approximately 360 meters above sea level. So that's a difference of 160 meters. I don't know the feet.
Yeah.
And how many different wines do you produce from this vineyard? I count maybe 6. Does that sound right?
So we have 3 different Grüner Veltliner Smaragds. Then we have the Riesling Smaragd Achleiten, which is more from the western end of the Achleiten. And then on the eastern end of the Achleiten, there's a different single vineyard site called Klaus. And there we also produce one Riesling, the Riesling Klaus. So in total, there would be, I think, 5 wines.
So, and then I asked your dad once, Robert, about the last time there was an old big cask, wooden cask in the cellar, and I think he told me that in 1996 the Danube flooded, and so you had water in the cellar, and that was the end of the wood, so it's only stainless steel. Only
stainless steel now, yeah, yeah. Yeah, so my grandfather, actually we had a very, very old wooden barrel that has been used for, I don't know how many decades, sorry, not centuries. But it has been used by my grandfather and by my parents too. And it was basically the best barrel in the house. I remember it from when I was a little kid, but I've never really had any experience in that cellar. But it's very funny because it's very common for my generation to take deep dives on YouTube and go down the rabbit hole. And so I did that too a few times. And once I ended up with a video of Frances Robinson in the late 80s in the cellar with my dad. She did some kind of TV show or some TV magazine and had a few exposés on wineries in different wine growing regions. Yeah. And so they visited my parents, and my father's English has improved since then, but back then it was very rudimentary and was during fermentation. So they went down to the cellar, and even on the video, you can basically see the CO2 concentration and it doesn't look healthy. My father then says, okay, yeah, this is the cellar, this is the wooden barrels, but we should be getting out now. It's like, oh, it's so beautiful, we have to capture that. And he's like getting even more nervous and said, it's about time now to move on. So that's actually the best representation I've had of the cellar, because my memories of a little child when I was 6 years old at the time are very limited.
Yeah, and you know, the other thing is when we see that picture of the stainless steel tanks, you know, your winemaking, I think your dad's winemaking and what you will continue with it, as far as I know, it's actually very, very sort of straightforward. It's really more about the vineyards, and this is something I always admired. It's when you visit the winery, you say very little about the winemaking. Really, it's really all about the terroir.
Yeah, and that's also because we basically we differentiate between the varieties, but we don't differentiate now, let's say, between Federspiel or Smaragd in that sense, because for us, grapes have to be treated equally. And the reason why we only have stainless steel tanks now is that we feel like it doesn't influence the wine in any shape or way, whereas wood has, of course, an influence, which can be, I'm not saying it's bad, but it's not something that we strive for in our style, because my parents have always been very clear they want the wines to represent the vineyards they were sourced from. And in order to get the full picture of that, we try to limit as much interference as possible. And one of the factors is, of course, also the cask of where you ferment the wine, be it now stainless steel vats or wooden barrels or stone barrels that are now existing. So, and we've always stuck since then with stainless steel vats exclusively.
And that's also the reason why we cut out all the botrytis during harvest, because we also don't want that influence. That's
for example a quality assurance measure for us. For example, that we feel we want to have elegant wines, and our customers are very happy for that, and they like that stylistic in that too. And for me personally, I think wines that have minimal influence of botrytis, so minimal to none, age better in a sense, because they may be in the first year a little bit enclosed and not quite as open, but after 5 or 6 years, they open up beautifully and they keep on aging beautifully. Whereas I think if you reach a certain level of botrytis, the same as Brettanomyces, for example, with red wine, or coriander when cooking, it's such a unique taste that it overtakes other tastes. And once you reach that threshold, yeah,
there's no going back.
Yeah.
So it's you try to take away all the botrytis. Then fermentation is spontaneous usually.
controlled spontaneous. So it's basically, so the difference being here is if you do a controlled spontaneous fermentation, you take basically a clean cut of the grapes of the vineyard that you want to have, and you really looked at the beautiful grapes, and you press them. You have about 50 liters in a balloon, and you try them to start fermenting. And therefore, you can see already if they're starting good, if there's basically good yeast available on the grapes. And by having a controlled spontaneous fermentation, another benefit is you already get a certain amount of yeast population. And then if you add this to the starting to ferment must, or the must that should be fermenting soon, you get a little head start because you already have a certain population of yeasts. At best, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the one strain that you really want to have in there. And therefore it helps you with fermentation way better, compared to completely spontaneous fermentation where you would just press everything up and put it into the tank.
And do you ever practice any of this maceration on the skins before the fermentation?
That's very dependent on the vintage. So for example, in cooler vintages, the maceration time is something that we strive for and try to have every year. But you know, with climate change, the last few years have been very challenging, especially during harvest period. So we've had to change the way we're working a little bit in the vineyards before harvest and also during harvest, and also the work in the cellars. So for us, the biggest, because now, I'm sorry that I have so many thoughts in my head, but now when we are harvesting, it's very important for us to get the grapes as fast as possible to the winery, because the harvesting temperatures during harvest, I should say, have been around 25 degrees Celsius in late September. So it's really, really warm. It's basically an Indian summer. And that goes on up until late October with 20 degrees and more. And usually I say back in the past when I was a child, it used to be the fact that with the starting of October, it would get significantly cooler. And therefore you wouldn't have to rush through the vineyards to pick the grapes and then have basically the fright that they might already start to ferment on the way to the winery. Because that's a really big problem, or can be a huge challenge to get them as quickly into the winery as possible, into the cellar. And luckily we have 3 presses. So for example, our press cycles, I should say, are very slow. So we press for about 5 to 6 hours with minimal pressure. And another important fact of our presses is they can be cooled down. I can't really control the temperature per se, but I can cool them down to 8 degrees Celsius. And therefore I can let them macerate a little bit in the presses during even hot vintages, because sometimes you still have to wait for, you know, a second batch of grapes from the vineyard before it's feasible to start the press, because otherwise it's just, the yield is too less in the press to start pressing already. And so there I have then maybe a little bit of maceration time of a few hours, but yeah. So it's in cooler vintages definitely something what we do and strive for, but in the hotter vintages it has taken a step backwards.
I have one final question about winemaking. Do you ever allow the malolactic fermentation to occur? You block it?
Yeah. No, that's also a reason because why we only have stainless steel tanks, because for malolactic fermentation you can either inject basically the lactic bacteria, or you can have it on its own, or sometimes in wooden barrels it's also basically lives on in the wood. And I've talked with other vintners because I wanted to have an experiment with Riesling, because sometimes I've had a few Rieslings that have done malolactic fermentation, and due to the strong acidic structure in the Riesling variety, it actually was the case that you had in the one that I tasted, which was Grüner Kaltstädter Saumagen 2012 or 13. I'm not quite sure of the vintage. Wine from Germany, but it definitely had a malolactic, I think, because it had the creaminess of a perfect Burgundy Chardonnay, and still the steely, nice acidic structure that I wish and want to have from a Riesling. So for me, I love to drink really good Chardonnay too. So for me, it was basically a match made in heaven. And so I wanted to try that out myself. And I asked a few vintners that do, for example, Chardonnay and do a lot of malolactic fermentation. And I asked them of the risk of cross infections that you don't want to have. And he basically said, well, it happens. Sometimes it can just really happen. And so I'm too scared of doing that experiment, for example, now, because I don't want to have a barrel, for example, in my cellar, and then have the risk of potentially having a malolactic fermentation in the Grüner Veltliner, which I don't really want to have.
Yeah. Yeah, and it would completely, I think, be a different style than what we know from you.
That too.
I wanted to, we have some wines that we wanted to taste together today. And the first is a very important wine for you, a very important wine for us. It is the Hinter der Burg Federspiel Grüner Veltliner. And Hinter der Burg, it would be something like behind the castle, but I don't see a castle in Weissenkerken ever. Do you know? Tell me what the
castle is actually a part of the village. A part of the village is called castle, and therefore it isn't really a castle. You've probably seen it. It's you've been to my parents' house. So if you look in the garden, if you look up, you see basically above the house there's another
row of houses.
Row of houses on a huge rock, basically, and that's the Burg.
But it basically, I think it goes back to the times when there were defense walls. And I think there were 4 defense walls in the Wachau Valley. One was in Weissenkirchen, and that is the castle, so to say, right?
Are you mixing up stuff?
Okay, maybe I'm mixing up stuff. But generally, there is no castle. It's still called behind the castle. It's not a castle.
Castle, Burg really refers to this specific part of Weissenkirchen. You can have like a mantled bridge. It's Williamsburg without the Williams.
Exactly.
Because I haven't seen a castle in Williamsburg either.
You know, I'll make a little plug for this fantastic app people can download. It's called My Wachau. You can also go to the Vineyard Wachau website, and you have the most incredible vineyard maps. So if you care to follow along and see exactly where these vineyards are, I recommend this app or the Vineyard Wachau website. But the Hinter der Burg is at the bottom of the Hinterzeiber. And one thing that Toni has always told me about the vineyard is that it has this Schotter in it. This is it gravel from the old?
Yeah, and it's mostly Braunerde, which just really translates to brown soil. So it's not that of an interesting title for the soil type. But in general, what it has is really great water storing capabilities and great nutrient availability. And that's what we really want to have from a vineyard for Grüner Veltliner. Because Grüner Veltliner,
Oh, deep soils.
Deep soils, yeah. It's a deep, rich soil. And on such a soil, you don't want to plant Riesling because, I mean, you would get good grapes from there, I'm sure, but they wouldn't be great. Because Riesling, on the other hand, as we will see then with the other soil profiles of Steinriegel, for example, Riesling actually benefits from moderate dry stress. So when Riesling wines face moderate dry stress, they are more inclined to produce more varietal aromas and transport them into the grapes than, for example, a Grüner Veltliner does. So Grüner Veltliner mostly shuts down when the water supply isn't sufficient. So I like to refer to them as Riesling is a little bit more of a masochist, so it needs worse soils or not soils, whereas Grüner Veltliner is like a diva and wants to be treated really well and wants to have great soils, great water storage capabilities, all the jazz you can get basically. And so that's also why historically the Rieslings also, if you look, for example, in Germany in the Mosel, the steep slopes are not really good soils for anything other than wine, for actually wine. And inside the Vitis vinifera, Riesling does best there.
Yeah. And is that generally how it is that when you have these deeper soils, like in this case, you have the this deep sort of gravelly soil, that's where you would find Grüner Veltliner, and where you have very rocky, meager soils, that's usually a site for Riesling.
Yeah, usually it's that. Yeah. So it's especially true for us. Other vintners might plant a little bit different, but usually it's mostly the case for everybody, or for most of the vineyards that I see here. So Grüner Veltliner on the better soils and Riesling on the not as good soils.
Yeah, that Grüner Veltliner Federspiel hinter der BURG is just so, it really is the Prager style. It's almost like the calling card. It's so clear, so fresh, so linear. It just has such great precision of flavor, and it's Federspiel. It's sort of like your entry-level wine, but it's super bottled wine.
It's actually a good point that you mentioned, because for me, I mean, of course, you can see it as quality levels, Steinfeder, Federspiel, and Smaragd, but also those categories were established, as we said, in 1983. And we've come now to a moment in time where it's, in some vintages, more difficult to produce Federspiel than to produce Smaragd due to the climate change and the increase of our heat zones and everything. So for me, it's more of it's not another step upwards. It's a wine for a different occasion. So, for example, if you want to have just a glass of wine with friends, an aperitif before dinner,
or a bottle of wine with friends,
I choose the Federspiel, And if it's later in the night and after dinner, I'd go more for the Smaragd ones, or for food pairing styles. And it's also really important for me that as you said, it's our entry-level wine, that the quality is always great. So
it should represent the whole range of wines that you have.
Yeah.
You should start with the best, and then it just gets better. That's somehow the case.
Yeah. So because that's, for me, if I can speak now personally out of personal wine consumer side, if I've been to several wineries, and what's for me always really sad is when I'm at a winery and they have a great range of different wines, and let's say the first wine costs 10 euros and then the most expensive wine costs, I don't know, 100 euros or something. And I try the first wine, and you may not even be able to try the most expensive wine because it's so exclusive. And I try the first wine and it's just not there, and then you try the next one and suddenly there's like this huge jump in increase. And for me, that's not disingenuous, but for me, it doesn't ruin is too strong of a word, but it waters down the prestige of the winery in a sense for me.
Sometimes I have this experience in Burgundy. It's a big step from the Bourgogne Rouge or Blanc to the Lage.
And it's and it's same goes for me also too with the with the corks, or in general the capsules, how you store the wines. Because if I buy a wine that's over 40 euros and it has a plastic cork in it, then I'm also asking myself a few questions.
I have a little bit of older RIED Achleiten Grüner Veltliner Smaragd in my glass. It's the 2014 vintage.
Yeah, I have it here
Got that too.
Ah,
the 18 to the BURG I didn't have anymore. I'm sorry.
It's actually quite a cool vintage, and one that was a challenge for not just Austria but many parts in Europe. Cool and rainy, but I remember loving your 2014, so I'm very happy to open this again.
Thank you. Yeah, no, 14 was actually really challenging vintage. So it was very cool and wet. And the problem was not the amount of rain or anything like that, but the distances between the rainfall. So you had, for example, you were just applying your sprays, and with your best luck, of course, in the next few hours it would rain again. So you would have to reapply the sprays and so on and so forth. So in that sense, it was a very challenging vintage. And then also you had to be patient to wait for the right ripeness levels in the grapes. So in that sense, you had to be patient, and you had to know your vineyards to really a top-notch extent to produce great wines in that vintage still. And I think that this vintage was basically, in the Austrian press at least, down in the ground before the grapes were even harvested. Like at the beginning of September, it was already, it's got to be the worst vintage of this millennial basically.
It wasn't.
And for me, it's not really the case, because I think even in vintages that are not considered great, great winemakers and great producers can produce outstanding wines still.
And this not only has that very layered, almost sort of smoky quality that I find in Achleiten a lot, but it's also very salty. It's very saline. So
that's also for me one of the main characteristics of the 14. I feel like, because also the Rieslings had a very nice salinity in it. I think especially Klaus 14 was, for me personally, extremely mouth-watering. So it's one of the vintages that I really like. And also 16 is also a vintage that I'm a huge fan of.
This is the soil, and when we talk about soil in Achleiten, there's not much soil, topsoil at least, on the surface, at least when I've walked through the vineyard. So it's the rock is sort of almost on the surface.
Yeah, it really depends on where you are in the Achleiten. So you can have, for example, like our soil profile here this is basically from the site that we sourced from the grapes for the Grüner Veltliner Achleiten. You can see that this is now a much deeper soil for the Achleiten, I would say. So for the Achleiten, this is really a nice deep soil. And this is also what you find in the lower terraces, mostly. Also due to erosion over the centuries, it just accumulated more soil was accumulated there. And the further up you go, the shallower it gets. Or not even the further up you go, it can also be that you go to the west, northwest slightly, you go up the slope, and then you're suddenly in a vineyard where you want to dig down, and you'll hit a huge rock after 10, 15 centimeters or something like that. And then you go further and you can dig down twice that, So it's very bright, how should I put this? It differs extremely on where you are in the Achleiten. And that was also the big challenge of making the maps for my master thesis to show this in a sensible and logical way, how different about Achleiten can be and how it differs.
How scattered.
Yeah.
I think we have to climb further up the Achleiten now to the STOCKKULTUR, which is a fascinating wine. You have very old vines here, a very old parcel, but also hopefully you can see in the picture, it's planted in a very unique way. That's the STOCKKULTUR.
Yeah, and STOCKKULTUR actually also it's the name of the training system. So those poles that you see here, the literal translation would be stock. So it's a pole culture. So you grow the wines alongside the poles, and you bind the shoots, you bind them together at the very top of those poles that you see here. And this is actually how wine growing used to look all over the place in the Wachau before the mechanization of wine growing, before you really had a tractor and you had
the 1950s.
Yeah, before you had the so-called Hochkultur, where you had the wiring system in place and everything. And so you have this Hochkultur is basically now standard wine growing procedure everywhere in Austria. But the STOCKKULTUR is also, it's a traditional way of growing wines that you not only find in Austria, but you'll find in Burgundy. They also have
South Africa.
In South Africa, they have it in Santorini, for example, in a different way with the basket wines. So they also have a very low, so you'll find that all over Europe, you find
Stockkultur.
Yeah, head-trained wines that are very close to the ground, and also where the density is really high. And that is also one of the significant changes to the Hochkultur, because in the Hochkultur you always have to have at least 1 meter 60 centimeters between the rows for the tractor to pass through. Due to the fact that you don't need a tractor for these vineyards, or that wasn't the case because you didn't even have one, the planting was much more dense. So it's basically 1 meter by 1 meter. You'll have wines everywhere.
Mm-hmm. But the Stockkultur way of planting is almost gone in the Wachau.
Yeah.
It's basically, I think there's just a few vineyards that have this training system now, and our Stockkultur, I think, was planted in the 1930s.
Yeah.
So it's over 90 years old already. I mean, crazy.
I'm tasting the 2017 Stockkultur, and it smells and tastes like old vines, like very concentrated, very dense on the palate. Fantastic, very layered in flavor.
Mm-hmm.
What I really love is especially the difference between normal Achleiten and Stockkultur, because the normal Achleiten is more for me like a classic representation of Grüner Veltliner Smaragd. If you want to have a classic Grüner Veltliner Smaragd, I'd say go for the Achleiten. That's a classic expression. Stockkultur has almost exotic fruit notes a little bit. It's much deeper. I wouldn't say more complex, but richer in its facets a little bit due to the different fruit notes that you get that you don't typically get from Grüner Veltliner.
But that's maybe because for me it's more, the Stockkultur is more concentrated than the Achleiten in taste. And that might be because of the soil that radiates warmth in the night as well.
True.
So the berries get more of the richness to it, I think.
So you get a little bit more heat during the evening hours, so that's true too, yeah.
Wow, and isn't it true that these terraces are very typical of Wachau? Don't they also give some heat back?
Yeah, they also radiate heat, and they're also really important for biodiversity due to the fact that they are basically the home of all the lizards of the Wachau. So we have those, the Smaragd wines. The name Smaragd is actually named after the emerald lizard that you find everywhere. And if you walk through a vineyard with those dry stone walls, you'll hear the sizzling of the leaves. As soon as you pass through, they're everywhere in there, and it's a beautiful sight to see, because if you approach slowly, you might see them like having a sun bath on the stones there.
Mm-hmm. They like to sunbathe on the stones, right?
Yeah.
Get a sun.
And they're so cute because they're always scared. I mean, of course, I would be too if I saw something that is, I don't know, 200 times bigger than me, but still, it's cute for me.
People are always fascinated by this wine. This is the WACHSTUM Bodenstein Grüner Veltliner Smaragd, and this is what we always say. It's the Noah's Ark project of Toni Bodenstein, but we'd like to hear the explanation from you. By the way, the picture that Sophie sent, this is the WACHSTUM Bodenstein vineyard at the top of the Achleiten, right?
Exactly.
Grüner Veltliner, yeah.
It's the highest one on the Achleiten that we have.
Yeah. And here in the background, you can also see the village of Weißenkirchen, see the train tracks and the road along the Danube there. And I think even our winery at the
very end of it.
Far end, yeah.
I see Heinzle, the restaurant Heinzle.
Yeah. Now you're making me hungry.
Yeah.
Yeah, so basically the idea behind this vineyard is, I'm just gonna
rewind.
Yeah, start from the beginning here. So basically when you plant a vineyard, usually you go to your nursery and you have a certain plot of land that you want to plant wines with. So you choose, according to the soils that you have, a certain rootstock. And then on top of that, there's a variety that's being grafted. And inside the varieties, be it Grüner Veltliner, you have certain subtypes of it. And usually if you plant a vineyard, you choose one rootstock. And one of those, let's call it Y subtype Y of Grüner Veltliner, and this one combination is being planted over this whole vineyard space that you have available. Thus creating basically genetically identical plants. They're the same. If you look at them, if you do a gene sequence, they're the same plants basically.
Like twins.
Yeah. Even
identical twins.
Not even identical twins, because even they have differences. It's more like the real clone. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's a general problem in agriculture with the erosion of the genetic diversity. You see it in crops everywhere. You see it in corn especially, for example.
Apples,
everything, because you have to see it from the side of a nursery. If I have a nursery of, and I have 5 different Grüner Veltliners, and all the vintners of Austria only buy 3 types of those, the chances are very high that after 5 to 10 years, I'm going to get rid of the other 2 types of variety, subtypes of Grüner Veltliner, and I'm going to replace them with something different that sells. And in the worst case, this genetic information is then being lost, because there might be a few vineyards that still have those types of Grüner Veltliner, but who knows? And therefore, my father wanted to basically point out and show that this erosion of genetic information is also happening in viticulture, not only in general agriculture, and that also vintners have to be aware of that. Then therefore, he wanted to have a vineyard that is basically a gemischter Satz of Grüner Veltliner. So gemischter Satz is also a name in Austrian wine terms. Yeah. It's a blend of one vineyard plot where you have different varieties and you blend them all together. And here it is a plot of land that is planted with 100 different types of Grüner Veltliner. And they're being harvested at the same time. So you have some of them that are a little underripe, some a little overripe, but in the best case, most of them are in the ripeness that we want them to have. And so it's in the sense, so just to highlight the differences of those is because you have to imagine those varieties that differ in the grape structure. For example, the looseness of the single berries in a single grape, how tight they are together, how loose they are, the thickness of the grape skin, how many single berries are on a grape. Those are major influences, growth influences that have a huge influence of making wine later on. And also the size of the single berries, be it small, thick, those all influence how the wine will taste afterwards. And my father wanted to have, first of all, high genetic variance in this vineyard. And also he wanted to see how it reflects in the wine. And for me, the WACHSTUM Bodenstein wines are maybe a little bit closed up in the first year. They may have some green tannins due to, some smaller berries being crushed a little bit too hard. But I think they age beautifully and they have such an elegant, steely character that I'm having a Riesling 216. And they have such a nice, elegant character with such depth of flavors. So for me, that's basically one of the things why it was worth it to go through all the trouble of finding different types of Grüner Veltliner and planting them all in the same plot of land.
But maybe to sum this up, it's not just one type of Grüner Veltliner, it's 100 different types exactly that are in this vineyard.
And the same applies to the Riesling WACHSTUM Bodenstein. However, Riesling WACHSTUM Bodenstein is not on the Achleiten. It's at the very top of the ZWERITHALER. And that's our highest vineyard actually that we have. It's 460 meters above sea level. And here we have now about 60 different types of Riesling. Mostly from Germany, from Geisenheim, but also a few from Alsace in France and from Austria.
It's the first time you've ever described it to me as a gemischter Satz of Grüner Veltliner, and I love thinking about that that idea when I'm tasting that wine. So complete. And by the way, this is always, it's interesting that it was a Noah's Ark project, preserve biodiversity originally, and now it's one of your highest rated wines that you produce every vintage. Speaking of highly rated, you just recently received a 100-point score from Falstaff for your RIED ZWERITHALER KAMMERGUT, a 2019 vintage. I'm tasting the 2017 today, but this is a vineyard near the Achleiten, maybe just a little bit to the east, right?
A little bit to the east, yeah. Actually, it's after Klaus. There's one site in between. So you have Klaus, and then you have one site in between, and then you have ZWERITHALER. Mm-hmm. And the KAMMERGUT is actually here in the picture. It's on the lower end of the picture, and it's not even fully on because it goes basically like to the left of where you have this little tree at the bottom on the left-hand side of the picture, and up that slope there's the KAMMERGUT. And
KAMMERGUT was actually a name that we gave the wine,
or
that your father gave the wine, exactly, because it is, KAMMERGUT means it's a small little room, so to say. KAMMERGUT is an Austrian or German word for a small, old kind of room.
Like a parcel, like a sub-parcel or something?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So if you're looking on your My Wachau app, I think you're looking at the Buchenberg, first of all.
Yeah.
This is the bigger site is called the RIED Buchenberg. Inside of that, you find ZWERITHALER, and then you're taking this tiny parcel that you've named KAMMERGUT, and it's very old vines, planted, well, at least 100-year-old.
100-year-old, yeah, 1906, 1907 was the planting year. However, I have to rectify one information. It was said that they're own rooted, which is unfortunately not the case due to the phylloxera happening in the 1850s. So, of course, they are also grafted wines. So, however, they're still 100 years old, 100-year-old grafted wines. And that's actually a beautiful picture of one of those. I refer to them as creatures, to be honest, because they're so individualistic, those wines. If you go through, you won't see one wine that looks like another one. The way they grow and the old wood is so thick, and it's
and the roots go down at least 15 meters to the ground.
I haven't banked them out
because it must be, because it's so old, and they're like monsters. Yeah, they're spread it around. And
I didn't say monster.
Yeah, creatures. It's the same.
I didn't say it with any negative connotation. Creature
it's
was
not a negative.
Just to elevate him from a plant. Because they're more than that.
The two of you make such a nice couple.
Well, I wanted to say your pronunciation for ZWERITHALER is. We would never know that you are an American. It's like a typical Austrian the way you said it.
Das ist nett von dir. Und here's the soil type, and it does look as though there is some, like a streak of limestone going through it.
Right in the middle, almost, yeah. So actually limestone is not that common in the Wachau Valley. So chalky soils are not really often seen. In the Achleiten you have a few parcels that have a little bit more chalk, but generally it's rather chalk-free. In the ZWERITHALER you find a little bit more limestone too. And then Steinregel, of course, is also a site where you find more limestone.
Yeah, and I don't have the Steinregel to taste today, but this is a very interesting vineyard. It's extremely steep. And also, you have a high percentage of calcareous rock in this vineyard, which is very unusual for Austria, very unusual for the Wachau.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, how it influences the wine, I can't say. It's a fun fact. But like also the marble parts that we have in there, it's I don't think that the influences on the wine are that significant. I think they have influence on the wine in the way they are weathering and then are being broken down and through pedogenesis of soil being created. thus having an influence later on. But the direct influence, I wouldn't overstate it too much. I think what's really important for the Steinreger is more the northern facing side valley aspect of it, especially. We get a lot of cool winds in there. That's also one of the reasons why it's one of the sites that has more of a danger of late frost events happening. But luckily, well, we've been rather lucky with those in the last few years.
So it's very steep. The soil is very, very meager, very rocky and stony, and it's a cooler site. So this seems like a Riesling site to me.
Right?
No, it seems like a Riesling site.
Perfect, yeah.
And sometimes when I'm tasting Steinriegel, and it's just because I know there's limestone or calcareous there, I start to think about Rieslings maybe from Alsace or something. It's just there's a very particular taste. So I don't know. I think that it could be that the soil is influencing the taste.
True, but I think I always thought that the chalk content of the soil was the main influence of the specific taste. That's what I always brought it down to. But I have to cross-reference it with a few wines from Alsace. I haven't had the chance to try that many of them lately, unfortunately, but I have to get a few more on my hands on a few more. We've been there 2 years ago, I think now, but it was so hot I couldn't take any wines with me, unfortunately, which was quite a shame being in that region and not being able to bring any bottle.
Well, for me, the Steinriegel is always my favorite wine from our whole portfolio is always Steinriegel, because it is a wine made from terraces and made for the terrace, in my opinion. Because it is so mouth-watering, it has such a great acidity, and you drink it outside in the summer. And I mean, it's perfect with sushi and any kind of raw fish, but still you don't even have to eat anything with it, because it's just, it feeds you and it feeds your soul so much because of the taste of it. And yeah, for me, that's the summer wine. That's
the acidic structure is so vibrant in it.
Exactly. When I can come see you next in Weissenkirchen, I'll bring a bottle of Trimbach Clos St. Hune, and we'll study it.
Yes,
we'll do.
We'll study very hard.
That's that very chalky soil that we were just speaking about in Steinriegel, and then. For many fans of your winery, this is one of the ultimate wines that you produce. It's very distinctive, but very very shy when it's young. It's the RIED Klaus, but this is always one of the great Rieslings that comes out of the Wachau every year. Prager RIED Klaus.
Thank you.
I'm 17.
Ah, nice. Treating yourself, I see. Cheerio.
So it's almost like it's a continuation of the Achleiten.
It's a continuation of the Achleiten. They're on the same hill, actually. And that's one of the most funny things. Usually when you have basically one hill, it's usually one site as well. Why would you denominate it in different sites? It's one hill. The thing is, the separation between Achleiten and Klaus is already a couple centuries old. And for researching purposes for my master thesis, also found this old paper of the taxes that people had to pay, for harvesting in the Achleiten and so on. First of all, what's really interesting is that back then the harvest, it was, in terms of taxes, it was cheaper to have the sites at the very top of the Achleiten. They were taxed lower than the lower sites, mostly because people didn't have any cars or anything, so they had to carry all those grapes down into the village, therefore having much more work probably. And also back then, the denomination Klaus and Achleiten already existed. And what's really interesting is that there is at the very top of, so you have this little road between Achleiten and Klaus, and we've seen it in the first Achleiten picture. I think it goes up basically, and then it spreads out, and that's when the RIED Klaus starts on the lower side too. And if you follow this road up to a point where you're about 300 meters above sea level, there is basically the border between Achleiten and Klaus. And what's very funny is that here is also a real geological border between the Gneis of the Achleiten in the upper parts and the amphibolite of the Klaus in the lower, of the Klaus in the same height. And there is no mixed zone layer between those two geological zones. And usually if one zone of one geological zone goes into another, you have some kind of mixed zone there. But due to the fact that this change basically was brought on by basically, how's it called? Yeah, the Hodge. Not erosion, but basically, you know, the soil coming down in a, you know, force of nature type of situation. If you can follow my weird English now, you don't have any mixed zone layer between those two geological zones, because basically through the pressure it was just.
I mean, it's sort of like a graben, like a, it's a where the,
yeah. Landslide, basically, that's what I was looking for.
Yeah.
Landslide. So it must have been, you know, thousands of years ago, there was a huge landslide that basically separated those two sides. So therefore, you have no mixed zone layer. It's really just from Gneis to the amphibolite. And in the lower parts of the Achleiten, as well as the Klaus, you'll find Gneis. So Gneis is dominating in the lower side. So they are in the lower terraces, they are more similar to each other. That's also why, if you open up the app My Wachau, you'll see also the denomination line between the sides. You also see that the Klaus basically, it doesn't go to the eastern side of the Achleiten. You know what I mean? It doesn't go. It doesn't have an eastern exposition overlooking the village. It's exclusively on the western side to southwestern side and south side.
Wow. I'm not sure if I put these in the right order because the Klaus is so distinctive, has so much character and personality. But our final wine that we're tasting today together is the Riesling WACHSTUM Bodenstein.
A note on the Klaus, if I may. What I really love about the Klaus, because you said it's very closed up and a little bit shy in the first year, which is totally true. What I love about it is, what I personally think is it keeps the primary aromas for such a long time, so that even after, I don't know, 10, 15 years, the Klaus can feel significantly younger. Because I've had, for example, 1990, my birth year, in 2016, and I had a blind tasting with study colleagues of mine, and everybody guessed it had to be from, you know, the late 2000s, some 2009, 2010, maybe 11 even. Nobody guessed it was from 1990s or even the 90s. Only one girl guessed. It was, she guessed 97. And everybody was like, no, blasphemy, can't be that old.
The best examples of Klaus I've had are the old ones. When I'm at the winery tasting with you, sometimes you'll treat us to something old. And I totally really believe it's Klaus needs time in the bottle to really just explode. And one final wine, WACHSTUM Bodenstein, Riesling Smaragd, and your eye in this picture has to go all the way to the top of the screen because you're at the very, very top, something like, I don't know, 450 meters or something, right?
Yeah, that's our highest elevation that we have. And right above our vineyard there is actually the road leading to the Weinviertel and further on to the Czech Republic. And basically right after that there's wood. So we are right next to the forest actually up there.
Wow.
So that's really, really close. So therefore we always had to, because we did a little bit of, we replanted parts of it in 2015 it was. And, you know, for the very young shoots, we already had, you know, the little protective layer. But the rabbits and the deer still got to it. So, but I don't fault them. You know, there were some really great Riesling wines that are being planted there. I mean, of course, I was angry when they ate the only shoot that was there. But still, I can't fault him for having a try.
It's the very top of the Cyberberg, and this I think was before the Grüner Veltliner vineyard of WACHSTUM Bodenstein. This was planted even before that, right?
Yeah, and that's where the funny anecdote came from, where my grandfather basically told my father they are not gonna ripen up there. Like, if you can't plant Riesling up there, because my grandfather had something else planted up there. And my father wanted to plant Riesling there because it was so high up, and he said the elevation will do wonders for Riesling. And my grandfather said, no, they're not gonna ripen out there. It's stupid, it's a stupid idea. You're just wasting money by doing that. But he proved him wrong.
Yeah, and I think also this this intuition, I think your father had to go for the very high sites, has proven to be a good thing with warmer temperatures and things. So, well,
like my grandfather was saying in the mid-2000s, he was basically saying, oh, you were right all along. Like, when you saw the first signs of climate change happening and, you know, increases in summer temperatures and so on and so forth, was very interesting to see how they basically came together. So yeah, good idea then.
I appreciate you. We've gone a few minutes over, but thank you so much for taking so much time this evening to talk through these wines. And if you don't mind just telling us, so the WACHSTUM Bodenstein, top of the Cyberberg, and also it's the same concept as the Grüner Veltliner with many different clones. 25 or something like that.
60 already.
How many?
Because 60.
Whoa. Wow.
Yeah, because as I said, we did a little bit of replanting in 2015, and by doing that, we expanded on the varieties that the types of Rieslings that we had. So, for example, back then, 5 years ago,
way back when,
we also planted more of the 300 series of Geisenheim, for example, that is being sourced from the very oldest vineyards in Germany. So 326 and 364, they have those weird numbers. So it's basically, you have different series of Rieslings, and I'm pretty sure, I can't link it now because I haven't looked at the link in ages, but the University of Geisenheim has a great guide on different subtypes of Riesling and how they differ in their sugar accumulation, acid accumulation, acid structure, the way they grow, the way they look differently. Can't link it now, but I'm gonna send it to you, Jesse, because it's so interesting to see that. And yeah, so during the replanting, most of it came from Geisenheim during the replanting.
That's about 60.
And now we have in total about 60 different types of Riesling there.
Wow. And I think I did choose the right order because even though the Klaus is sort of dark and mysterious, this WACHSTUM Bodenstein has such, it's high tone, it's got this cut to it, so salty, so mineral. So.
Is it the 2016 vintage?
And by the way, yeah, exactly. I'm tasting 2016. Which your neighbor, good. Your neighbor, Rudy Piekler says, he says it's actually was a cool vintage. I'm so surprised. I think of these vintages as of late being so warm, but we're back to a nice, cool, fresh vintage, huh?
16 was actually quite refreshing. That's why I said before too, it's one of my favorite vintages of the last decade, due to the fact that it was much more like a vintage from the 90s. It was much cooler. It wasn't too cold or anything. We had a lot more rainfalls. In Germany, it was very, very bad in a sense that it was very difficult to spray in a lot of regions. I know from when I was studying there, a lot of witnesses talked about that, changing to organic viticulture and being in the last year of you know, before getting the certification, and then stopping it in 2016 because they said they can't continue because otherwise they're losing all the yield and stuff. So yeah, for me, it's a beautiful vintage that is reminiscent of yeah, the 90s vintages that I've tried already in my life. Not too many though. but unfortunately. But for me, it's one of the best vintages of the last decade. Definitely concur with Rudy here.
Yeah, fantastic. This has been great. You took some extra time, so thank you for taking.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much for having us. I mean,
taste with us, and everyone watching now and watching on YouTube. I definitely recommend this app called My Wachau. I use it all the time to study the region, and it's just a region of so much diversity in the wines. We're talking about Grüner, Veltliner, and Riesling, but wines that have such distinction from one vineyard to the next, and you really see that when you're tasting the wines of Weingut Prager. So Robert and Sophie, thank you so much for the time. I hope to see you soon in Eisenkirchen.
Wait so long already.
We'll be back.
I think you meant to, we'll be back.
Let's get to the top.
Thank you both.
Thank you so much.